Shadows are calling, the curtain is drawn. How far we've fallen, I'm out on the run. Live in the violence, die by the sword. Deep in the fire, that's where darkness is born.
Hello, everyone. Happy someday of 2025. I don't even know what day it is anymore between all of these fires out here in Southern California and terrorist attacks, and just 2025 is already a blur. And I've realized I need to stop foreshadowing episodes I'm planning on doing next when I'm recording, because these crazy events keep happening and I pivot to cover them while they're relevant and then get out of order and delayed, and I contradict myself. I had originally planned to talk about the recruitment process and failures of the military this week and another case from Hawaii, but given the recent events that happened here in the US in the first week of 2025, I'm switching it up to talk about a few subjects that so many military wives are all too familiar with, and that's PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, and of course, the effects of those on home life. I also want to discuss the vulnerability of veterans and their susceptibility to radicalization. I'm going to talk about the two events from New Year's Day that have been so prevalent in the news that obviously both involved service members. I have received several emails just asking my thoughts on what really happened, and there are so many opinions floating around and conspiracy theories spreading. I'm going to do my best to put a lot of the military jargon into layman terms, because I know it can be really hard to grasp and follow what people are talking about when they're floating words like gravitic propulsion systems and VBIEDs. I first want to talk about what happened with active duty Special Operations Forces soldier Matthew Livelsberger, because I really feel like the wrong people are weighing in on this event that happened. They're putting out these knee-jerk reactions and just fueling false narratives. And so I, a person who's quite familiar with PTSD and combat soldiers, and a person who's lived through a lot of events surrounding their behaviors and how the military handles them, I wanted to weigh in and give you all an idea of what I believe was likely going on with Matthew. I assume most people at this point are aware of the event in Las Vegas involving Matthew Livelsberger that unfolded on New Year's Day. The 37-year-old active duty special operations soldier drove to Trump Tower in a rented Cybertruck, where he then blew the Cybertruck up. He had filled it with cam fuel and fireworks. And now this is where that term I mentioned earlier comes into play, VBIED. That just means a bomb in a vehicle, or technically a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, or a car bomb. Luckily, nobody but Matthew died during this event, which is very fortunate given the alternatives. And 7 people were injured, but I do believe they're all making full recoveries. So we've now entered the phase where wild conspiracy theories are being tossed around and people are working really hard to find the why behind this event. Now, I've previously mentioned that I myself can be a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, so I've really gone down every rabbit hole and considered all of the ones I've heard. So I'm going to share all of these conspiracies that are currently floating around and then explain my stance, and you can decide for yourself what you think is most likely. So Matthew rents this Cybertruck and he's very proud of it. He starts texting an ex-girlfriend he hasn't seen in a few years about how he feels like he's on Halo or he's Batman when driving it. And he drives the Cybertruck to Las Vegas. And this is all within hours of the terrorist attack by another service member in New Orleans named Shamsuddin Jabbar. And of course, those events happening so closely in time together, both by service members, it would incite conspiracy theories that these men were working in tandem. And after all, they'd both been stationed at the same places. They'd been in Afghanistan at the same time. But let's put a pin in that, because I'm going to loop back and discuss that attack and their commonalities in part 2 of this episode. So, the Cybertruck blows up in front of the Trump Tower. And as I mentioned, it only causes injury to 7 people. I shouldn't say it only, but only 7 people are injured. Nobody dies, because ultimately it doesn't seem to be that inflicting injury or death on others was the goal of this event by Matthew. But he's not getting a free pass from me, because he really could have killed somebody coming out of the Trump building, a mom walking by with a stroller, anyone. So No free pass, but it's alleged that Matthew's cause of death was from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and a gun was found at his feet. The blast is believed to have come after the gunshot, and this blast wasn't astronomical by any means. And that just adds more fuel, not to make a pun, but more fuel to the fire of conspiracies, because if anyone wanted to make an epic bomb that could do serious damage, it would be a man who worked the positions Matthew worked and had the knowledge he had. So this confused many. Now, Elon Musk would share that the reason this blast was so futile was because of the build of the Cybertruck. So it left people wondering if maybe Matthew just didn't realize the Cybertruck would mitigate the explosion. Who knows? I actually think that Cybertrucks look like a new age dumpster on wheels, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, Musk said regarding this blast, or lack thereof, that the bomber picked the wrong vehicle. The Cybertruck actually contained the explosion and directed it upwards, which if you watch the video, it looks like a significant blast to me, but it does seem to go in an upward trajectory. The theories began to run wild, and the first was largely that Matthew was targeting Trump, some even referring to this as an attack on Trump's life, because people assume, because of there being a Tesla involved and being at Trump Tower, that there was a political agenda against the rising administration. However, this theory seems to have been debunked because many have been able to attest to the fact that Matthew was a huge supporter of Trump and Elon Musk, and many of his grievances seem to be with the Biden administration. Matthew also confirms this in his writings that were discovered after his death. It seems Matthew's intent was more about drawing attention to his message that would come out after his death than anything to do with the explosion. I think he just thought dying with fireworks and a bomb, VBIED, were cool. Another very prominent theory is that these two events that happened on New Year's Day are the product of MK Ultra. If you aren't familiar with MK Ultra, let me break that down simply for you. MK Ultra was a human experimentation program designed by the US Central Intelligence Agency to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. The project officially ran from 1953 and was officially and allegedly halted in 1973. But there are several people out there who believe that this program is actively still being utilized today. And this is a belief that is picking up momentum, as a lot of people have been theorizing that Luigi Mangione, the young man accused of shooting the United Healthcare CEO, was in fact a part of the MK Ultra project and a victim of mind control and brainwashing. There have been other people in history and in recent history. I think it's Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas shooter from 2017. People thought he was a part of MK Ultra. And I think it happens when just these unlikely people emerge without criminal histories. And there's really no, you can't find the symptomatic behaviors building up to it. Like nobody saw this coming. And people are like, well, this must be mind control. So some of the tactics of the CIA were to alter and manipulate the subject's state of mind and brain functions by using psychoactive drugs, electroshock, extreme temperatures, and essentially just many forms of human torture. In some areas under American control in history in Europe and Asia, the CIA created secret detention centers where they would capture people suspected of being enemies' agents and run these experiments on them. Now, if you're a fan, like me, of the Netflix series Stranger Things, I love that show, their depictions of what they're doing to Eleven and the other children are largely based on MK Ultra experiments and the subsequent US government cover-ups. And to make matters worse, there's basically no records to be accessed due to the nature of the crimes against humanity the CIA was committing in these experiments. So because of the extreme secrecy surrounding the CIA program, there are several prominent and outspoken individuals who believe these operations are still being performed by the CIA into present day. And honestly, wouldn't be surprised. The second theory we have is that this was a terrorist attack. And I understand why this would be alleged because we see more and more veterans increasingly getting involved in extremist groups, whether they're white nationalists or ISIS or any number of hate groups. Veterans and active duty service members are specifically targeted for recruitment. There's several reasons extremist groups will target military veterans and members to join their extremist groups and causes. The main reason include the skills these veterans have. If anybody's going to be good at getting and building weaponry, handling them, getting groups to fall in line, hand-to-hand combat, etc., it's going to be those with years of combat service. And they're all vulnerable while they're struggling with the transition to civilian life, which I also want to mention is often the same time frame we see them murdering their wives or girlfriends or children and then dying by suicide. It's a really dangerous time for veterans. Other reasons of susceptibility may include the trauma they've experienced. And essentially, these veterans, a lot of them are coming out of 20 years of service and feel like they have had their whole lives ruined over military service during the global war on terrorism. They feel like, what was it all for? They're suffering moral injury. I think one of the biggest things that we civilians lack understanding around is what these veterans are actually struggling with. I think many of us assume it's from missing their brothers in arms, the rush from their missions, the struggle to get over the depravity of what they've had to witness and participate in. And I think all of those things are a part of it. But what I hear the most when I talk to vets is that they're struggling with why they even went to war. What was it all for? What was accomplished? They almost feel bamboozled, for lack of a better word, because they now have returned to what they feel is an eroding society. After perhaps dozens of deployments, they have serious injuries that are not taken seriously. They may very well be victims of military sexual trauma and sexual assault, or even falsely investigated for an EO complaint. So hate is festering, and they find like minded individuals online, and a new purpose is gained. 20 to 30 years ago, it wasn't so easy to connect with like minded people. But now it's easy to find these lines of communication with other disgruntled, like minded people over the internet. We have this out of control social media landscape where certain groups can actually have gamified algorithms. Now, if that's not a familiar term for you, a gamified algorithm, that just means that the social media algorithm can incorporate game-like elements such as points, levels, challenges, rewards to enhance user engagement and motivation within a non-game context, like learning context. And they do this with the intent purpose of creating radicalized pipelines. Whether it's racial supremacists, incels, Christian nationalists, alt-right groups, radical leftists, every single one of those has echo chambers and pipelines which have led to attacks in America and around the world. The internet is a dangerous place, my friends. And I can very honestly think of like 1,000 different times my ex-husband sat up all night with his laptop in his lap and a bottle of Jameson next to him, at his computer talking to God knows who about God knows what in chat rooms, angry, belligerent, ranting. He would be up all night at that computer, and it was spent one of three ways, right? It was either talking to like-minded angry people or fighting with them, non-like-minded people, watching porn, or playing video games. Those are common addictions among these men. And while they're suffering from PTSD and even traumatic brain injuries and feeling all this rage, they're even more susceptible to become extremists because now they're dealing with feelings of hypervigilance and even paranoia. And I often say when I'm speaking about acts of violence, when these men kill in their civilian life, their wives or kids or whatever, it's an easier leap for them to jump to violence than civilians because of their training and military mindset. They've already broken through the natural human resistance of taking lives, as well as the conditioning that violence is never the answer, right? Us civilians were like, oh, violence is never the answer. But they've already been conditioned that's not the case. Sometimes it is the answer. So they don't have filter in their minds, most of the rest of us do, that stop us from committing acts of violence. And for those of you who do not know, PTSD and or traumatic brain injuries will often display behaviors of hypervigilance, paranoia and delusion, and even hallucinations. I've heard stories many times from spouses out there who can recount their husbands starting to become untethered from reality. And I've witnessed that myself. Now, one of the main driving forces behind these conspiracy theories has been the letters and manifesto of Matthews that were found posthumously. A very famous podcast host and veteran with a large following, Sean Ryan, he came forward with information he actually received from Sam Shoemate. Sam's a retired Army and an intelligence officer, and he received an email from Matthew prior to Matthew's death, and he brought that onto Sean's podcast. And then while he was talking to Sean, Sean searched his own inbox and realized he too had communications from Matthew. And the FBI has since confirmed that these communications were in fact legitimately from Matthew Livelsberger. Now, Matthew made several accusations. So let me start with what these communications said and kind of break them down into layman's terms. Essentially, the letter contained allegations of advanced drone technology, war crimes that Matthew witnessed and participated in, and then accusations that Matthew claimed he was under surveillance by the US government. He claimed that FBI or Homeland Security was following him and, quote, they're looking to make a move on me. Matthew said that airstrikes that occurred in 2019 were in fact war crimes that were covered up by the military. The attack in question was an airstrike in Nimruz province, Afghanistan, on May 5th of 2019. He said the operation was supposed to be targeting drug facilities located across Nimruz province that the military alleged were all drug labs. The U.S. alleged that these drug labs, 125 of them, were controlled by the Taliban and operated exclusively by its combatants. However, after the airstrike occurred, UNAMA, that stands for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, they began receiving reports that were credible, alleging there was massive civilian harm being done, with anywhere from 40 to 200 civilian casualties. So, over the next several months, UNAMA investigators conducted several interviews with residents who were near the impacted sites. Local sources would share that while some of the bomb sites were drug labs, many others were residential homes and even a marketplace with shops and fuels and vehicles. In the end, UNAMA was able to confirm that 89 civilians were killed, 52 injured, and 4 additional people undetermined. And of those 89 killed, the vast majority were children. I think I saw like 80 were children. Now, in addition to those deaths, the investigators found out that of the facilities targeted by the U.S., they were not exclusively controlled by the Taliban and were in fact not performing any combat functions. So despicable. And of course, the military initially denied these claims and said there were 0 civilian casualties. But after UNAMA published its results, they were forced to concede and simply admitted it was possible there were civilian casualties. Were there any repercussions? I couldn't find any. I really don't think so. But I think Matthew is proof of the repercussions to the war fighters involved. The moral injury done to the participants' psyches seems immeasurable. And I always think that a punishment like that is far worse than in a prison cell or court-ordered punishment. And in regard to how that event left Matthew, he would say in his manifesto, these graphic encounters replay in my head every day, all day. It has ruined my relationship with my family and friends. I'm now a shell of a human being with nothing left to live for. It's been taken away by my affiliations. And this next part is a sentiment I spoke of earlier, one I feel I hear regularly and often from veterans. Matthew said, there was not a time during my 2 years in Afghanistan where I had clear understanding of or a rational feeling in my heart of why my brothers and I were fighting and dying. We failed, and the credibility of the military and political leadership was shredded when no one was held accountable. What a burden to carry. Now, the other allegation Matthew made in his letter was regarding all the drones that have been recently spotted. Matthew was working with drones within his new role in the military, and he alleged that the drones we've been seeing in America over on the East Coast are gravitic propulsion drones from China spying on us. What's a gravitic propulsion drone, you ask? Great question. Essentially, they would be drones that defy science. And there's a very long-winded explanation that someone much smarter than me has out there, a complicated reasoning about warping space-time and all of these things, which come down to really just you would need to defy physics to have one of these. But in the end, Matthew's main claim about these Chinese spy drones were that they had unlimited payload capacity, which just means that they had no limit to how much weight they could carry. So that means they could carry bombs or anything else and just park themselves over the White House and do irreprehensible damage in the US. So, another theory that goes along with this that I find incredibly likely and interesting myself is that members of the military or government entities may have known that Matthew's knowledge of the war crimes in 2019 were weighing heavily on him or making him a threat as a whistleblower. And so they fed him this false information about the drone. This tactic is a form of essentially double crossing. It's been used in history to shut down whistleblowers. When a whistleblower is armed with real circumstances that could be harmful, they will be introduced fantastically wild theories to discredit them in their testimony, because then people think, oh, these are absurd claims. They can't be right if that one's that absurd. It makes people question the validity of the truthful claims. So we look at Matthew, and he's on one hand presenting facts of real war crimes that the UN has verified. But then he's adding in this fantastical story about Chinese spy drones that defy gravity. And this will overall discredit him from being heard. Now, to most people, like myself, who aren't scientists, the idea of a Chinese anti gravity drone may sound like it could be created. Like, okay, the war crimes are true. Maybe there's some truth to these Chinese drone claims. Surely it's plausible and some genius scientist could work that out. But from all the scientific articles I've read, there's just no plausible way to create this without defying physics itself. There would need to be several fundamental changes to aerospace engineering that are just pretty much impossible. So, what seems more plausible is that Matthew was showing cracks in his mental health. He was maybe talking about how much he was struggling with the war crimes to somebody that he was a part of in 2019, and maybe somebody from the government fed him this fantastical information about drones in hopes he would be put through a mental health board and quietly retired with 100% disability and just go live the rest of your life. And there's a good chance that was the plan. Unfortunately for Matthew, he didn't take the bait. Now, it's also possible, totally possible, that he was just delusional on his own, but there are examples in history where whistleblowers were influenced to be made uncredible. A perfect example that I read was in the 1990s when Gulf War veterans started to raise concerns about chemical weapon exposures and illnesses and side effects they think they were having. They were influenced to also think that there was a secret weapons testing taking place, which wasn't credible. But because they were trying to whistleblow on both, they were completely discredited. And in the end, they were indeed experiencing illness from nerve gas. That illness was called Gulf War illness, and it took nearly 3 decades for scientists to determine that it was caused by nerve gas sarin that was largely responsible. Now, can I say for sure that this is what happened to Matthew? He was fed false information? No. No, I can't. This is just one of the theories that I think has some legs to it. I have the same resources as all of you for the most part, a computer and a thirst for knowledge, and I go down every rabbit hole. I don't have more intel on this situation than that. But what I do have is a first person experience of what it's like to watch a warfighter descend into darkness and succumb to mental illness. Matthew was 19 years in. He just had to sit a few more months and he would have been golden. But Matthew's conscience was eating him alive. And after his wife left him with his child because of alleged infidelity, and who knows, he did have a history of accusations of domestic violence, which we see go hand in hand with these mental issues with soldiers, he hit rock bottom. He decided he needed to tell the world, and so we have the events of New Year's Day. In my heart and in my mind, while I do absolutely believe the war crimes Matthew alleged occurred in 2019, I don't actually think anybody was following him to silence him. Quite frankly and sadly, the war crimes had already been divulged, they'd been investigated and found to be true, and no heads were rolling as a result. I think we're at this really sad point in our world where we're all very aware that meaningless airstrikes and deaths are happening in these countries and that women and children and innocent lives are being lost all of the time. So I don't think many Americans would be shocked hearing about it. And so for that reason, I don't believe the FBI or Homeland would waste their time surveilling a person like Matthew to silence him. I just truly think he was a man suffering from demons he couldn't outrun. Now, Matthew also called for a military takeover in his manifesto, urging veterans and police officers to take over by force of power and line the streets to DC, basically martial law. And he pleaded with Americans to embrace the new era of Trump and Elon Musk. He stated that his last act wasn't an act of terrorism, but a wake up call for the American people. And I hope more than anything that it was a wake up call about just how much our veterans and service members are suffering from mental illness. I think we're quite frankly very lucky that Matthew didn't kill his wife and child first. And I know that his family and friends would hate to hear that and say, no, he wouldn't do that. He wasn't like that. But I promise you, no one knows aside how dark it really was for him, okay, besides his wife or his ex-wife. Because so often we see that these service members take their wives' lives and their own lives, and people around them are surprised. And we see this rush to judgment since Matthew has died and his writings were released. Like, oh, this isn't an act from mental illness. This was a cover up from the government. And this is why I said we don't need the commentary from the Politico talking heads and the peanut gallery, right? People who don't understand how PTSD and TBIs manifest and how altered a person can be from these untreated afflictions. I see comments like, this guy was so nice. He definitely wouldn't do this, like his neighbors. And they say, I want answers. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, a member of the US House of Representatives, actually posted a screenshot from Sean Ryan's. She got the letter, the email that went to Sean Ryan, and she took a screenshot and she posted it with the accusations of war crimes. And she captioned it, "This changes everything," fueling rumors to her mass following that this was something besides a service member during an extreme unraveling of his mental health. And it's this mindset that makes me so upset. You know, people saying he was a great special forces dude. He couldn't have done this. It has to be something else. And acting as if mental health isn't enough to cause death and destruction. That's a dangerous rhetoric to spread because it needs to be taken seriously as it so often ends in death and destruction. And a guy can be the best operator on a Tuesday and go home and kill his wife and kids and himself that very night. Because being a good soldier and mentally ill are not mutually exclusive. These guys are incredibly good at compartmentalizing. That's why, ladies who are listening to me, who are married to these guys right now, everyone's telling you what a good guy he is, how good he is his job. He's so good. He's such a leader. And you're like, he is a psychopath. Maybe that's true too. We don't know. They're incredibly good at compartmentalizing until they aren't. And we usually see an event that precipitates them snapping, usually within their home life. Maybe somebody in their command didn't like them, and boom, they get randomly drug tested and popped for steroid use, and now their 15-year career is in jeopardy. Maybe their wife caught them cheating. So many of them are. Maybe they had a false allegation or a real one filed against them. But we see some pre-event and then they snap. And the people who are in the know are not the guys in the foxholes with them per se, or the trenches, or the Humvee, or going outside the wire, whatever idiom you want to use. It's the wives and partners who know how out of sorts these men are, and no one listens to us. It's the women like me who have awoken in the middle of the night with their husbands' hands wrapped around their necks and a blank look on their face as they're having a flashback. Or they wake up with a Glock pointed at them. The women like me who've been sleeping in their cars and hiding from their husbands for fear of their lives. Or they're sleeping in a separate bedroom with a dresser and several pieces of furniture up against that door to keep their husband out while he's raging, with holes in the door from their husband's fist and drywall all over the house that needs to be repaired. And if you're shaking your head and nodding because you're going through this, please make a safety plan. Because it's the wives and girlfriends who will tell you exactly what it's like when these men are suffering. And they're telling people, they're telling military brass, family advocacy, military police, and they're silenced again and again and again. I know Matthew talked about how the events of 2019 ruined him, but it should also be of note that he had a trail of exes, ex-wives, girlfriends, and he'd been accused of domestic violence prior. So, like so many other combat service members, these are alleged. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about domestic violence on a show about domestic violence. Now, I didn't know Matthew Livelsberger, and yet I feel like I know him like the back of my hand. I don't know his combat experience, nor have I talked to any of his loved ones, but I'd almost bet my life that he had a traumatic brain injury, as so many of those guys in tactical roles do, especially those dealing with explosives or who have experienced blast over pressure from weapon systems or breaching. I can tell you exactly what it's like to watch them try to hide their brain fog, their memory lapses, and sink deeper into depression and paranoia and then get resent into combat again. And so, to all of you who are looking for some boogeyman to blame this on, some CIA operative or Homeland guy who snuck a VBIED into Matthew's truck and took him out because he knew of civilian deaths or Chinese drones, you're looking for a red herring to blame this on. You're on a fool's errand. Because at the end of the day, the only monsters Matthew and men like this are running from are the ones in their head. And the only people to blame for this is the military leaders who refuse to make treatment for PTSD and traumatic brain injuries mandatory. Now, don't get me wrong. The military will require an interview and some respite time when these soldiers return home from combat. But these men know how to pass those interviews. They know what they need to say to get through this brief mental health audit. And the military also does offer numerous programs for struggling men. But asking for help will mean that you're going to be put under a microscope. So my question is, why isn't every single service member put under the microscope immediately? Why do we leave it up to them to ask for help? I watched my ex-husband get away with pretending to be fine for multiple deployments, all while unraveling at home once the BDUs came off. He could pass that initial assessment, but then he'd come home and just lose his mind. Had the military given him much more stringent exams or required him to go into some type of living, rehabilitation for a decompression time while he first got home, there's no way he would have passed. The only big bad wolf in this scenario is a military that operates under a don't ask, don't tell when regarding the mental health of its service members because they don't want to lose manpower or their weapons, which are the men. They don't necessarily want to identify the traumatic brain injuries. That could mean some of their best warriors would have to give up combat. But what if we took those valuable men and rehabilitated them and put them into positions like instructors or other non-deployable roles? Sure, they'd hate that, but then we'd be mitigating the deaths of women, children, and suicides of these men. And I know the military acknowledges the vast number of suicides and mental health issues, and they say they want to fix it, but they're not investing enough into the rehabilitation of these men. And look, I don't know if my solutions are feasible, right? That's not my expertise. I'm just saying what they're doing now isn't the solution. There has to be a massive restructuring of our military, or we're going to continue to see veterans and active duty service members kill their wives, kill their girlfriends, kill their children, commit acts of terrorism, and kill themselves. What they're doing is not working. We've sent hundreds of billions of dollars to other countries for foreign military aid. Hundreds of billions. We need to invest in the mental health of our service members and veterans. TRICARE reimbursement is terrible. They're losing contracts with hospitals. I know because I work in those hospital systems. TRICARE is a nightmare. The VA, don't get me started. If you want a boogeyman, if you want a conspiracy in this whole thing, it's the United States military who lets sick men continue to operate. Now, I want to talk about the connection or the commonalities, at least, between Matthew Livelsberger and Shamsuddin Jabbar. Because another belief is that these two were working in cahoots together. And while they do have a few commonalities, I'm going to save that for part 2 because I want to talk about Shamsuddin's history of domestic violence, his plan to kill his family, and more. So please tune in next time. Thanks for listening, and please remember, if your loved one seems to be struggling with hypervigilance or paranoia or any of these side effects, not only are they not safe, but neither are you and your children. They need help. Please quietly make a plan to go visit friends or family, whatever you need to do to get your children and you to safety before you ring that bell. But then you need to ring that bell. Tell someone they need help. They can't fix this on their own. And while they may end up medically boarded and being forced out, you and they will remain alive. They will get disability. Get out to safety and get them help. Ring that bell. Please be safe. Thank you.